Okay, so in the previous short video, again, we were going over the wildfire as a process and over the fire environment itself, the behavior of the fire. So we had just covered fuel. Let's go real fast. We had just covered fuel, and now we're going to cover topography, how that is one of the factors that will influence the environment and the behavior of the fire. So in terms of topography, moisture content is going to be very, very highly dependent on the topography of where you are. So, for example, in the northern hemisphere, south-facing slopes are going to be drier and warmer because they have a greater exposure to the sun. In the southern hemisphere, the northern slopes are going to be drier and warmer because they have a greater sun exposure. Okay, so that is one of the things to take into account in terms of topography. Circulation of air is actually also associated with topography. Slopes with, for example, some of the slopes are going to have more wind exposure, and that is going to cause them to be more dry and to burn more easily. So circulation of air is also very important, and it only happens to certain slopes, depending on where you are, obviously, in the mountain topography itself. And finally, if the fires, for example, are burning at steeper slopes, then the flames themselves, as they go up vertically, may preheat areas that are up above a little bit faster, as you're sort of seeing in the image over here on the bottom. So you're seeing that the slope is pretty steep, so the flames themselves are closer to the trees over here, and hence doing the preheating work a little bit faster. And again, on the second one up here is where you can see the wind action, and we'll see it in the next slide as well. I should also mention that in mountainous terrains, the fires actually circulate up through canyons during the daytime. So that's another thing to take into account in terms of topography, that the fires will circulate up through those canyons during the daytime. And now the last factor in terms of determining the wildfire behavior in a specific environment, which is going to be weather. So there are many things that kind of go into weather, and those will be the temperature in the place where the wildfire may take place, the precipitation, the relative humidity, and the wind. So temperature is very clear. If you have high temperatures, then you are able to preserve the fire. If you have very low ones, then not, because fire needs heat. Okay? All right. So here I put droughts. So droughts are usually associated with hot and dry conditions. So usually the soil moisture content is very low. So probably precipitation hasn't happened very much so during that time. So during droughts, there can also be what are called dry thunderstorms. So a dry thunderstorms happen where water that actually happens in a storm is evaporated prior to reaching the ground because of the high heat. But the lightning related to the thunderstorm still occurs. So once the the lightning actually strikes, it will still ignite things. And with no water to stop that ignition because the water evaporated, then there will be combustion. Okay. If you guys think of relative humidity as part of those effects from weather, basically fires will burn best at, what do you think, high or low relative humidity? So if you thought low, that's right. And as we saw in a few chapters ago, I can't remember which one it was. I think it was 2 chapters ago for relative humidity. When you have lowest relative humidity is going to be typically times of the day during the late afternoon and early evening. Those are typically times where you have the lowest relative humidity. So those are also times when you have greatest increase in fire activity, for example. And if you think of wind, as we saw in the previous slide, and in this slide actually, sorry, in the diagram, wind will help preheat on burnt areas. So if it's very strong, it will carry the flames a little further, and now the flames are able to radiate that heat towards the new unburnt areas. And they can also carry embers away. So as you're seeing here in the image, it's kind of hard to see, but you have a spot fire that happened due to the embers that were in the fire and traveled through and probably lit that top crown of the tree. So that's another action that wind can take. Okay, so with that, we've covered the 3 factors that influence the fire behavior overall. So again, those are going to be weather, topography, and fuel. All right. So with that, we move on to types of fires themselves. So there's also 3. Things seem to come in 3s during this chapter. So officially 3 types of fires. First one is ground fire, second one surface fire, and the third one crown fire. And those are classified based on the layer of fuel that allows the fire to spread. And we'll go through that. But usually it's not as simple as that. Usually a fire, like a wildfire, will go through all 3 stages during its life, or at least 2 of them. Usually the crown stage doesn't happen always, but the ground and surface ones are very common to happen together. If the crown stage occurs, usually all 3 are occurring at some point during the wildfire's life. So we'll go through them. So the first one again is going to be the ground fire stage. So what happens here is that the fires will creep along the floor, usually as smoldering combustion. So remember, that's not the flaming one. That's more the really hot ground that basically heats up everything in a way that it will combust. So the image I put here, although it's the same one from your book, it's not the best because you are seeing some flaming combustion, but there's probably smoldering combustion going on in the ground over here as well. Okay, so usually this type of fire, the ground fire, occurs in peat fires. So again, peat, remember, is that decayed material that is kind of like accumulation of that decayed material in kind of swampy and boggy areas. So it occurs in peat fires and also in decaying organic material. So that's no surprise, as they basically mean the same thing, but peat is a little bit more mature decaying organic material. So here, this is a new thing I had no idea about, but this decaying organic material, prior to becoming peat, is going to be called duff. So there you go. Learn things every day. So the second type of fire is going to be the surface fires. So they usually do have flaming and also smoldering combustion going on as a mechanism for combustion itself. Usually they move along the ground and they vary greatly in intensity. They can be fairly low intensity or very high intensity. They mostly burn through grass and down limbs in the shrubs. Oh, down limbs of the trees and also through shrubs, sorry. And they usually burn relatively slowly. So ground fires are probably the slowest ones, surface second, and then the crown fires the fastest ones. Usually surface and ground fires occur together. So the other picture I had, really this one is although part of it is probably ground fire, you see that some of it is already a surface fire, right? So you have flaming combustion, some of the limbs are starting to catch on fire. Definitely the shrubbery and the grass around is starting to catch on fire as well. So the last type of fire, and probably the most dangerous of all 3, is the crown fires. So in this type of fire, you mostly see flaming combustion, at least at first. So this flaming combustion happens and is carried through the canopies of the trees, so top of the trees pretty much completely. So it's generally aided by a lot of wind, and as we saw in a couple of slides ago, also by steep slopes. So it would be kind of these 2 processes going on, the preheating of new material that makes that spot fire happen in the canopy of the next tree, and again by topography the same idea would occur. So they're very, very hard to stop because they're so high up that it's usually kind of like a done deal. Once you have a crown fire, there's very little things you can do for it to stop, and it usually extends upwards in slope, right? So it's very hard for firemen to stop this type of fire. Okay, so which geographic regions are at risk from wildfires? So although the book only told you about North America in terms of geographic regions that are at risk, wildfires happen all throughout the world. They mostly occur in the fairly northern and fairly southern hemisphere. They don't occur very much in the tropics because usually in the tropics you have very high moisture. But they still happen. Back home, I'm again from Colombia, and I remember very vividly a fire that happened maybe like 12, 14 years ago near my home. It occurred in a hill slope, so that's to be expected, and it occurred during a dry season. Also, an El Niño effect phenomenon was going on, so we had a fairly larger, if you would, drought. So they can happen pretty much anywhere. And worldwide, they're common in the Mediterranean Sea because it's very dry. They also happen a lot in Chile, and they're seeing a rise in them in Chile, actually. But they also happen in South Africa and in Australia, for example, in the Southern Hemisphere. You also saw this year that they happen very greatly in Scandinavia, in Sweden. I think in Norway it spread even a little bit also. So they can happen pretty much anywhere. But in North America, they can happen pretty much anywhere that will have fuel. Well, anywhere in the world, sorry. That will have fuel, oxygen, and heat. That's right. And then they're constrained by the three factors: fuel, topography, and weather. So if you have any place that meets the right conditions, you can have a wildfire. In North America, though, it's kind of in most areas of North America, they're going to be within or in close proximity to areas that have grassland, shrublands, woodlands, or tundra. So a lot of North America, especially a lot of Western North America. So large wildfires are very common in Alaska, in the western contiguous U.S., and also in the Canadian Rockies. So basically just a continuation of the western U.S. Also in Canada, they happened at a belt that extends from the Yukon Territory, which is next to Alaska, all the way to the southeast of Lake Superior and then to the east of Labrador. So I lived in Yellowknife in Canada, which is up in the Northwest Territories. And I went to visit, again, I lived there with my uncle and aunt. They still live up there. And so I went to visit in 2014 summer, and they had a very, very large fire. So that belt that they talk about going on in Canada, part of it goes through the Northwest Territories. And so that is part of the region where here in the book they tell you that is, prone to wildfires. So coming a little bit closer to home, we know that Idaho experiences a lot of wildfires. In fact, as this image kind of shows you, I think this image, what does it say? Wildfires of more than 250 acres from 1980 to 2003. So we see that Idaho is probably one of the states that has the most amount of wildfires going on of all of the states, at least in the US, right? I wish they gave us a picture of Canada because I'm very, very curious to know. In fact, I'm going to look it up in a little bit just to see how different it is, because also they have less aid overall because there's less hazard to the people since there's not as many people. So I want to see how constrained or how much they actually regulate their fires up there. I encourage you to do the same thing.